why don't we get started today? So this is we want to just welcome you all to this Project People Supporter Circle event. We're going to be hosting these events once a month with a different member of our steering council. And the intention here is to have a kind of an intimate gathering of friends who want to learn more about Indigenous solutions and the organization and the project that we've kickstarted called Project Peoples, which we're going to get into shortly. But before we do, we want to introduce our friend and speaker for today, David Karabelnikoff, who is a member of the Project Peoples Steering Council and has been coordinating, working with us to develop the project over the last 2 years. And we're really thrilled to be able to have him here today to present on Indigenous perspectives on renewable energy systems, something that often we don't think about or equate together, but in fact these are we can bring a lens of Indigenous wisdom and perspective on just about any solution that we try to implement. And so David Karabelnikoff is a associate member of the Kanik tribe of Alaska. David's a descendant of the Ungangan and Dena'ina people, and his commitment to environmental sustainability is deeply rooted in Indigenous perspectives. He's a dedicated advocate for sustainable energy solutions and environmental stewardship, focusing on local applications and distributed networks for renewable energy systems. He actively integrates the perspectives of into these perspectives and weaving together Indigenous solutions into discussions around renewable energy and aiming to bridge that gap between traditional knowledge and modern technologies. So he's very passionate about empowering Native communities and leading that transition to clean energy from local perspectives. He's a member of the Tribal Alliance for Clean Energy, a member of course, the Project People Steering Council. He's a RegenIntel Cosmos Star, and he is an instructor for one of our solutions and practice sessions. So without further ado, we're going to pass it on to David to introduce this topic for today. And thank you all again for joining us for this series. David, on to you.
Thanks, Chad. I appreciate it. Yeah, my name's David Karabelnikoff. I'm Aleut and Athabascan and a member of the Kanik tribe. And I am super excited to be a part of Project Peoples. And I figured that I would also give a little bit of a presentation around my work at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy, just so that we could get a little bit of background as to what I do in my regular work on a day-to-day basis, helping tribes to develop renewable energy projects across Alaska, and as well as how that integrates into the discussion around Project Peoples of Indigenous solutions to climate change. So I'll share my screen here with my presentation, and we can continue on. But this is my favorite picture of Alaska, showing the vastness of it and the mountains and the rugged terrain. And so I always start my presentations with this one. And it also shows our proximity to the Arctic and to our eastern neighbors across the Arctic Ocean. And this is just the introduction on Alaska Natives and renewable energy technologies and my work at the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy. So the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy provides no-cost technical assistance to tribes that want to develop renewable energy projects. And this is, I think, a really important aspect to what we're doing with our philanthropic support, is to provide resources to tribes in the form of technical assistance and capacity building for tribes that want to develop renewable energy projects. And we're able to provide no-cost support for that and meet the communities where they're at in their renewable energy journey and help them to access, ideally, there's a lot of federal funding that came through the Biden administration that has really just been a little bit out of hand of many communities that wanted to pursue funding. And the Alliance has been able to come in and provide support for that. So we don't, we're all philanthropically funded. We don't get any, we work with tribes as partner communities to help them in their journey for energy sovereignty and self-determination. And so the Alliance offers energy services to tribes through our 4 pillars of support, and that it's built on a strong and deep foundation of Native American cultural values, and it's philanthropically funded that makes this possible. So we're 100% philanthropically funded. We don't accept federal or state dollars. So this gives us a lot of latitude in terms of our ability to make critiques of federal policy, or also just to be reactive and meet communities where they're at, and provide the needed technical assistance without having a lot of constraints on our efforts. And so the 4 pillars at the Alliance, the first pillar that I'm involved in is the technical assistance and finance pillar. I'll get into a little bit more about that later. We also have an energy policy and government relations pillar, which has been pursuing some FERC petitions currently, trying to address really cost prohibitive measures that the federal government has in place for renewable energy projects, in the guise of protecting against renewable energy speculation. And the attempt to do that has made some really significant barriers for tribes to participate in renewable energy projects in the interconnection queue. And so that's one thing that our government relations pillar has been doing. We also host events and have information resources. So our Tribal Energy and Equity Summit is our annual event that we put on, and is going to be in Minnesota this May. The last one was in Tulsa, Oklahoma last May. And it's a chance for tribes to come together and to have a listening session with federal representatives from the federal government to improve the access to federal dollars, and to improve government and tribal relationships. And then our last pillar is workforce development, and that's trying to build the capacity of the next generation of people to be employed in renewable energy projects, so that when we do we are successful in developing and getting projects funded, that we see local hire happen as much as possible in these communities, in these tribal communities, because it's not always the case that that local hire happens when big projects come into local tribal communities. And oftentimes, I think having that skilled workforce capacity building is really important to getting local hire to be an option for tribal members. And so under the technical assistance, and I went too far. Under the technical assistance and finance pillar, we can help communities with energy planning, with grant writing, we've done a lot of community change grants this year, which is a bit in the some significant funding opportunities for renewable energy projects and projects that address climate change and climate justice. And that within our technical assistance wheelhouse, we also help with project financing for larger utility scale projects, project design and engineering, project development, and we always try to facilitate tribal ownership of projects. Our goal is to see that renewable energy projects are tribally owned, and a lot of times in Alaska, in rural communities, what we see is tribal IPPs being created, or tribal independent power producers being created to own the renewable energy generation assets. And then we also help with transmission and interconnection for larger utility scale projects, as well as tribal utility formation. And that's been, I think, a lot of communities in Alaska don't have, it's not a locally controlled utility. So there's there's energy kind of insecurity in that situation with having outside interests controlling the local utility and maybe not keeping the standards very high, having a high number of outages and whatnot. So I think that having the having tribal utility formation is, I think, really an important aspect of tribal energy sovereignty that we help support. And so just to give an example of a project that we've been supporting in Alaska, is the Townick Solar Project. Townick is a small village across the inlet from Anchorage. It's about 300 people or so, and they are the off the road system, but tied to the grid. And so we're supporting the Townick's community change grant application to be an independent power producer and to generate approximately 4 megawatts AC of solar in the region. This would give a sustainable revenue stream to Tyonek, to the native village of Tyonek in perpetuity, that would be a reoccurring revenue stream for the tribe to do that would have unrestricted, funding. There wouldn't be any funding limitations on what they could do with the revenues generated from the renewable energy projects. So they could spend this towards housing needs. They could spend it towards the school. They could spend it towards language revitalization. Just having unrestricted funding for the tribe makes this a really, advantageous proposal, so that and this would be one of the second largest renewable energy project and the first utility scale tribal IPP in the state of Alaska. And so I'm just really excited about this opportunity to, have worked with the local tribal community to develop one of the leads to show that that tribes can be a part of the transition to renewable energy, that we can have our own energy sovereignty and self-reliance. There'd be a battery energy storage system connected with this project that would give 24 hours of energy storage to the community in the event of a blackout. So it gives increased reliability to the village. It has a lot of positive attributes and benefits to it. And I just think that that this could be a shining example of tribes demonstrating energy sovereignty and self-determination in the 21st century, and leading the transition to clean and renewable energy, which is quite I think not every and I think that renewable energy is much more in alignment with traditional ecological perspectives and values, so that it makes just a lot of sense for the two to go together. So I just wanted to do like a short overview of, the work that I do at the Alliance, and then we can jump into the Project Peoples conversation more as well, because I'm really excited to talk about Project Peoples and how Indigenous solutions to climate change can um, be when I first met with Chad and joined the steering committee, I was really excited to see that there was um, a non-native person that was trying to create a space for native voices and native values to be uplifted to the international decision-making levels on climate change. And that just really was so impactful for me to see someone working so um, and trying to um, connect them to leading scientists and to validate these ideas and concepts and come up with a much more I think a much more powerful solution to climate change than what we would come up with independently and alone and of ourselves. So I'll hand it back to Chad for a moment, and we can continue on. And I'll stop sharing my screen here.
Oh, well, thank you so much, David, for that presentation, and sort of like a clearer sense of like when we're talking about, indigenous solutions in the renewable energy sector, we see that there's a lot of activity here. There's the Alliance for Tribal Clean Energy has been working on projects, has been really advocating for the sovereignty, like Indigenous sovereignty and ownership of resources and connecting here. I think that's really important to highlight. And what I think, just so we're clear, why don't we jump into some Q&A around this first before we go into the Project People's piece? Because I think that might be
Okay,
useful.
absolutely.
Kat, your hand is raised. Do you want to jump in with a comment?
I actually have a question.
Okay.
So I'm starting the question asking. Thank you so much for this really amazing presentation, David. It's such a treat to hear about the incredible work you're doing in addition to Project Peoples. I'm really curious, could you speak more to the ways that you see tribal values and ideas being incorporated into these projects? And can you help us understand a little more, like, how are these projects being shaped by that? How might they look different from some of the other projects you'd see typically?
Yeah, well, I think a lot of it has to do with with tribal ownership of renewable energy projects. Like typically, a developer might come in and lease the land from a tribe and give the tribe basically like the minimalist possible for their land, and the tribe gets some benefit, but with the tribal ownership model, there's a lot more significant benefit to the local community in terms of of them being an owner operator of a renewable energy asset. Just really, I think, expands like the tribe's capacity for like thinking about what we can do to take our own destiny in our hands and actually deploy a renewable energy project, and maintain and operate that. Just gives such a different perspective as to, I mean, because renewable energy, there isn't anything inherently decolonial about renewable energy. It can be done just as colonially as fossil fuels. It can be done just as extractively to native communities, and just as so there's not, the technology itself isn't necessarily empowering to native communities, but I think that technology can be, and because it's carbon neutral, um, it has much more opportunity for, I think, for being in alignment with the ethos of taking care of the planet for future generations and having indigenous leadership in the transition to renewable energy is in, I think, the same light as indigenous solutions to climate change. Um, but and that's where technology, I think, is a lot of times pretty agnostic in terms of how it can be used for good, it can be used in not so great ways. um, and there's been plenty of renewable energy projects that have gotten tribal opposition to them, and significant opposition to them, and even to being the point of being shut down. And so that doesn't help anyone out. Everyone loses in that case. We don't get to deploy renewables. We don't get to decarbonize the energy system, but I think by working with renewable energy developers and tribes to form partnerships that are complementary, it's one more very like unique proponent to having a sovereign tribe that's in support of a renewable energy project and a potential owner of that project, than having them be an outsider to that development, and even a potential adversary to that development, because tribes have unique government to government consultation rights under the federal government, and they can make a really challenging and difficult adversary if the renewable energy project doesn't have tribal support. It just shows that that development isn't really being done in a very good fashion. Um, so I think that having indigenous perspectives with renewables allows for much more local community consultation, as well as for other considerations to be taken into account as well. But thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
Hannah, do you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you. Hi, David. Good to see you again. We met in New York. Um, excuse me if you said this in your presentation, but I was wondering how many communities you are working with directly. And also I'm wondering what you have in your portfolio that you consider renewable energies, and specifically, like, is hydro included in that, or do you look to do more protection of the rivers, or just what approaches that you take there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, I mean, there's definitely tribes that have been leading, and this is where I think we're like in this, like, fourth generation of this industrial revolution, where the first developments were often done at the backs of Native people and communities and tribes, where you had tribes that had their salmon streams and rivers and stocks depleted from renewable or from hydro projects that were done without consultation of the tribes, and often done to the detriment of tribes, where villages had to relocate from basins that were going to be flooded. um, I think, but at the same time, I think we're technologically kind of agnostic, and we're working with a community in the Bristol Bay region that's trying to do appropriate scale run of the river hydro, and their first and foremost is the salmon stream. So they're not only taking like the minimal permitting level standards for the salmon stock, but they're going above and beyond that, just to show the extra care that that run of the river hydro can be done, and that doesn't impact the salmon stream. So I think there's questions of scale in terms of technology when we think of hydro being only mega utility scale project, as opposed to there also being smaller scale hydro projects that are run of the river and not nearly as detrimental to that. Um, and like I think that it's like the previous question was kind of asked, is when projects are done with Native people in partnership, I think that we come up with far better solutions than we would have come up with if it was just a non-native system that was being planned, or like it just is. It's I think decolonial, for one, because so many of the energy infrastructure planning was done with the exclusion of Native people, and the country's history. And so having joint agreements that are made in order to do projects with Indigenous communities is a kind of a joint governance kind of structure, which I think is like the the something that I aspire to see happening more in the future. And especially with but I don't I think hydro has been done in a colonial fashion in the past, but that doesn't mean that the technology is all bad though either. And I think it's
Mm.
the approach in which those things are done is really significant and meaningful. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, I'm actually want to jump in because I'm glad we kind of are touching upon this subject, because right now I think, and particularly amongst a lot of Indigenous communities, even we have these discussions on our steering council, right? We have these on project peoples, where there's a clearly right now the way renewable energy systems are being implemented is extractive, particularly on Indigenous lands, particularly when thinking about critical materials and rare earth minerals, and the parts that need to go into creating, installing solar and wind, for that matter. And I was wondering if you could really comment on this from not necessarily the US perspective, but I'm kind of curious from a more international perspective, and thinking about how Indigenous lands around the world are, why and how do we stop mining practices on Indigenous lands, in the name of, being done in the name of, renewable energy systems, because we want that, and yet it also has this really negative externality of damaging and destroying native lands around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this is where it gets complicated when we move to the international, scale of of having technological solutions that aren't necessarily being planned in a fashion as to, will this technology, is it environmentally sustainable to scale this technology up for the adoption of 7 billion people on the planet. um, and that's not being taken into account with a lot of the technological solutions, especially lithium ion batteries. There's these um, global supply chain challenges that Indigenous peoples face due to the transition to, more electrification. And that's where I think, it's it's and this is where, you know, I I struggle sometimes to fully comprehend like what the solutions look like um, for international Indigenous peoples um, and the transition to renewable energy, because these two. But that's why I think that Project Peoples is such an important valuable conversation to be had, is because we're in this race to try to address climate change, but that can create a whole second wave of neocolonialism that's taking place in the name of addressing climate change. And really having the just transition conversation is so important, that it's not just a transition to renewable energy that the industrialized world is having their needs met, but also the indigenous communities of the world having their planetary boundaries being respected, and the ecosystems being respected, and the land rights being respected. Um, and so those are very challenging, like high level conversations to be thinking about. But I think that that's why Project Peoples needs to exist and needs to facilitate these conversations, and appreciate these platforms where these conversations can take place, because it's um it's not every day that those considerations are being made, especially for the ways that technologies are being deployed and at such scale that they have global ecological impact. And indigenous voices are not, you know, are marginalized at best, and having platforms that elevate them is, I think, really important.
Thank you. Megan, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was not to take us back, but this may be a silly question. I was really curious if there's been tribal discussion or input into the discussions around offshore wind turbines or wave energy or that kind of thing off the shores of Alaska. I mean, what's their feeling about that imposition?
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons why I'm glad to be working with the Alliance, is that we've actually tried to facilitate a lot of input from tribes on offshore wind conversations, especially in the lower 48, where it's more of a pressing concern. Um, we have huge amounts of marine resources in Alaska, but we don't have the populations really to scale that technology. We're looking at, pretty small scale microgrids that are sufficiently powered with onshore resources. And it's just also like we have ice in the winter in our oceans, so there's additional challenges that come up in Alaska that that other regions don't face, for the technologies to mature. They don't have to worry about the sea ice damaging like subsea cables and things like that. Um, but that's one of the things that the Alliance strives to do, is to facilitate tribal and governmental consultation and input, so that tribes do have a chance to input in these much more large scale development proposals, and off coastal developments.
Thank you.
Anna, please jump in.
Well,
This is
just
an open conversation.
yeah, thanks. Just to follow on that, here in Humboldt County in Northern California, there is a large proposal for offshore wind, and most of the tribes are against it. And one of the main reasons they're against it is because they were not consulted in the beginning. And there was
Yeah.
a lot of considerations that were not brought to the table that could have been to make the project much more environmentally friendly. And so it's very contentious here in this community. And so I really wish that had been done differently with the tribes, with a proper seat at the table.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's where, I mean, I guess being a proponent of renewable energy, I'm always hoping to um, be a conduit for helping projects, seek tribal consultation, and even more than just consultation, but ideally tribal partnership, so that they don't go down this road of um, angering communities and doing poor consultation and then finding more opposition to their projects than they would necessarily need to begin with. But that's
Mhm.
where I think that, like I said, I mean, renewable energy isn't inherently decolonial. We have to apply a decolonial lens to energy in order to solve the challenges. And also have a saying of decarbonizing our energy systems. It just isn't enough. We need to decolonize them as well to have a just
Mm.
transition. So that's both of those things are really important aspects to a just transition.
I think that's just like such an important point because it's something that it's particularly like I think as it pertains to Project Peoples, which is these are solutions that are derived from Indigenous wisdom and Indigenous lens and how we apply these solutions. But it's not just solutions for Indigenous peoples. They're Indigenous solutions for Indigenous peoples and everyone else. So when we're thinking about renewable energy systems, we can apply this practice to however we're implementing solutions across the world, right? So it's how do we decolonize and create more just equitable transition to a renewable energy system. It's not just for Indigenous peoples, it's for everybody. And so how we can apply that, and this is something this is going to be a thread throughout all of the Project Peoples solution sets, is how are these solutions not only for Indigenous communities but for everyone to learn from and weave into the implementation of all these different technologies and practices. Amrita, why don't you jump in?
Thanks, David. That was a really cool presentation. I think I learned a lot about what's kind of going on in the space in Alaska. I was a little curious about what some of these tribal consultations might look like and what that relationship with government is like. And I guess I'm coming at it from sort of being in New Zealand and seeing how Maori consultations go with government and what some of those trust issues look like, particularly given the colonial history here as well. And trying to ensure that those voices are captured, but not always doing a very good job at it. So I was just curious what that looks like in Alaska.
Yeah, well, there's federal government responsibilities for government to government consultation, and there was just another executive order that the Biden administration pushed out, directing more consultation, and this can vary, significantly across agency and department, and the federal government is a huge conglomerate that serves, a whole continent here and 576 federally recognized tribes. Um, but it's not nearly the same as having a treaty that obligates a by governmental approach. So we're stuck with a domestic dependent nation status here in the United States, as a relic of federal Indian law. And I think that that oftentimes, you know, tribal consultations haven't been a priority, but at least there's an executive order that's relatively recent that you can give to any federal department head to say that, hey, look, this is an issue that needs to have tribal consultation, and here's some directive on how to do that. And so the Alliance has been politely reminding, Department of Energy people that, there's an existing, a relatively recent, responsibility that they have to do more federal consultation. And some agencies are doing, quite well about that. I think with Department of Energy, there's also a needs for a community benefit plan for renewable energy projects to support disadvantaged and localized communities, which often would include tribes. So there's been efforts under this administration, I think, to do more to move in that direction. But the federal government in the United States has a long ways to go to adequately consulting tribes. And I guess it's always the like there's always room left for improvement in that process too, and oftentimes a lot to be desired as well. Um, so I think that we at least have some tools from this administration to spur more federal government to tribal consultation, at least.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm also curious, David, well, not, yeah, it's more of a comment in the space, I think, because we tend to think about Indigenous people solutions as within a little box, right? We tend to think of them as, nature-based solutions only, or agricultural solutions, or land protection and things like this. But this really, I think, opens up our eyes to where, Indigenous solutions can really play a role across systems. And I'm wondering also, though, where we see this integration happening. So, for example, one of our other steering council members, Sachem Hawkstorm, of the Schaghticoke First Nations, he's often talked to me about how in and community scale implementation of, say, renewable energy, solar powered water filtration systems, and how we kind of can kind of stack solutions in a way that are more holistic at the community scale. And I wondered if you could speak to a little bit about that, because I'm getting a sense as I'm hearing you talk about this, is it's really a lot about how, thinking about larger energy sourcing. So energy sourcing for grid capacity at the larger scale. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to more of a micro scale application, and what are some, integrations of renewable energy systems and technologies at local scales that may be, we might kind of imagine having a more sort of holistic or Indigenous perspective at the more of a local scale application.
Yeah, well, and I think that kind of gives me an opportunity to just talk about some of the villages in Alaska that are imminently facing relocation and that have to relocate. And my whole hope all along has been to see these village relocations be sustainable community development demonstration projects, where you have a village of 200 to 500 to maybe under 1,000 people, and you could use these opportunities to deploy renewable energy, to deploy energy efficiency building standards, to have a much more sustainable community project that is a demonstration, I think, for what what a regenerative community could look like in the future. And these villages have people are primarily subsisting off harvesting food from the land, so you have a deep attachment and connection to the land. These communities have done some of the least to contribute to fossil fuels, but are on the front lines to climate change. And my hope would be to see, in the same way that regenerative economic development is done, that we could come up with sustainable and regenerative community solutions at the scale of 500 people. So the investment cost and the scale of doing it isn't super large, but it could be a leader in terms of demonstrating what sustainable community development in the 21st century could look like. And what a transition to a regenerative community could look like. And so I think that having starting at village scale renewable energy projects, especially if we're able to do integrated energy and community planning, gives the opportunity to develop kind of greenfield sustainable development demonstration projects. And that's one thing I get really excited. It's kind of like turning lemons into lemonade, because we're dealing with climate change and frontline communities to climate change. But I still see that opportunity as being something really powerful and able to show Indigenous leadership and the transition away from fossil fuels and to renewable energy technologies, and using frontline community relocation efforts to do the climate change as leadership in the transition to a decarbonized society, and at a relatively small scale, like a village of a couple hundred people.
Yeah, I mean, it's both incredibly sad to contemplate the forced migration. We often talk at RegenIntel. We often talk about the great opportunity that comes at a terrible cost. This is the great opportunity to change everything because we have to, because of climate change, but it comes at such a terrible cost that we're experiencing today. We experienced yesterday, today, and we'll experience more tomorrow, and particularly frontline communities. But again, it's that also this opportunity that I think that you highlight so well to create models of what a regenerative community can actually look like by design. And in a position where you can integrate, technologies that are considered to be, part of the, Western or, scientific type of technologies, blending that with indigenous solutions and technologies themselves. So indigenous science and Western science coming together to, design really for future thinking and future-proof communities that are more resilient. So I really thank you, David. And I want to like if there's any other comments or questions people have, and otherwise we can talk a little bit about Project Peoples and wrap up. Does anybody else have any comments or questions for today? Okay, super. Thank you, David. And thank you all for joining today. We wanted to create this space to be an opportunity to learn more about the work that we're doing at Project Peoples, to get to know some of the Indigenous solutionists and leaders who are working on the front lines and working on the ground to implement solutions in ways that are regenerative. This is why this is a collaboration between RegenIntel, Global Solutions Alliance, Project Peoples, because we see this as such an important a part of creating a regenerative future. In fact, we launched Project Peoples in 2022. Just when we actually first registered RegenIntel and GSA, we launched Project Peoples a month later. And it was the very first project that we launched. And we did that, and at RegenIntel, we called it a keystone project, because we see this as a keystone for a regenerative economy, a regenerative society, the weaving of different knowledge systems together to create not siloed ways of knowing, siloed ways of thinking about not only about solutions, but frankly about ourselves, our communities, how we connect together, and of course how we're connected to nature, and how we're applying technologies and practices and ways of being in the world. And so that weaving of knowledge is such a fundamental part of it. And Project People is really born from that. And I don't know how many folks who may have heard this story before, but the origin of Project Peoples really began at a climate change conference at the COP 26 in Glasgow, at the House of Original Nations, which was an event that was being organized by a dear spirit sister of mine, Julia Jackson, and who was the founder of Grounded, who was originally the supporter of Project Peoples. But at the time, I was sitting next to Kat, actually, at this event, and had this moment of clarity, where looking at all these amazing Indigenous leaders that I had, many of whom I had known, because I've been working with Indigenous peoples for 16 years. And but I just seeing all these folks, talking about solutions and talking about their communities and territories, I had this moment of clarity that said, oh, wow, what if we were to bring together all these technologies and practices that are coming from Indigenous peoples, and weave them together with the work that we had been doing at Project Drawdown and beyond. And I ran up to Julia, who was in the front row, and she was in conversation with Grandmother Helen of the Sami people. And one does not interrupt an elder. You do not interrupt a grandmother. It's protocol. And I did, because it was such a powerful download. And I ran up and I just said, oh, I'm so sorry, I have to jump in. And Grandmother Helen, I'm so sorry. And I talked to her about what Project People's vision was, and she grabbed my hand and said, yes, I'm in it with you together. So, I had the blessing of Grandmother Helen, and then after beyond that, we decided to launch Project Peoples, and it took us some time to bring together a steering council of Indigenous leaders from all over the world, and we really curated that council with intention. Having worked in the Indigenous space for such a long time, we all know that as in any space, there's so many different ways of even addressing the Indigenous peoples movement. There's folks in the policy side, folks in activism, community development, um, um, spirituality, psychedelics, medicine, etc. There's so many different vantage points. And oftentimes they're not brought together. And so we really intentionally curated a steering council to be very holistic, intergenerational, interterritorial, interdisciplinary. So we have, found amazing leaders in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, shamans, alongside renewable energy experts like David, alongside activists on the ground, alongside policy people who've been working at the United Nations at the highest levels, working on Indigenous people's rights for decades, coming together as a steering council and in co-creation. We spent 15 weeks or more co-creating a first phase of this project, which was bringing together the steering council, coming together around what are Indigenous solutions, coming up with an Indigenous solutions framework, a methodology, an approach, an entire project outline for the next 3 years. And those of you who are familiar with Project Drawdown will recognize that Project People is very similar in that approach, except instead of bringing Western scientists and researchers and some Indigenous folks, but we're bringing all of these will be Indigenous solutionists. So coming from the source of knowledge of bringing that together to co-create a system of solutions that is derived from Indigenous peoples. And that's our phase 2. So the phase 1 was bringing together, co-creating the steering council and the methodology, the approach, the plan. And now phase 2 is recruiting and bringing together 20, 30, 40 Indigenous solutionists to contribute to that body of knowledge. There will be a book that we publish, just like Drawdown, where you flip the pages and you'll see Indigenous solution after Indigenous solution. You'll see the names of all of the contributors on that book. We're designing a platform for Indigenous peoples and solutionists to share knowledge and continue to evolve this as a living project. We have a documentary planning, and we have art projects and all these beautiful things that we want to co-create as a part of our collective desire to create a regenerative economy. And so Project Peoples is, we've finished our phase 1. We're in the fundraising process for phase 2. And so what we're doing with these outreach, the supporter circle gatherings is just to, gather more interest, gather more support, provide an opportunity for folks to learn more about what are Indigenous solutions and kind of change a little bit of ways of thinking, and shifting our way we think that. So it's like not just Indigenous people's land tenure, which is incredibly important. You have to remember that 80% of world's biodiversity is on Indigenous lands. And so protecting that is so fundamentally important. But there are so many other solutions that are derived from Indigenous wisdom that are 100% applicable to weaving together with any other solution, all the solution sets. And so in the Global Solutions Alliance and the collaboratory we're designing, we're taking all of the drawdown solutions and all of the Project People solutions and more, and weaving them together as a more composite system of solutions, and measuring, modeling, and communicating those solutions to the world so that we can have greater impact. So I want to thank you all for joining us today, learning from David, and being part of our supporters circle kickoff. And we're going to be having another one, like I said, another month. We'll bring another steering council member, Catherine Warapenga Iken, who's a Maori leader, to talk about metaphysics and spirituality and activism. But for now, I want to turn it over to Kat to close us out for this session. If you can, Kat.
Absolutely. So thank you all so much for coming, for sharing your curiosity and your excitement with us all today. It's truly been such a wonderful thing to get to spend this time with y'all on a Thursday or Friday, depending on your time zone. So yeah, please, we're asking that if this energized you, if you found it interesting, you do these two things. So we're asking that you please come to the next webinar. We'll send a follow-up email with the link to register. And we're asking that you bring a friend. So think of someone who would find this information interesting, someone who maybe is kind of searching for these ideas or this spark, or someone who you're just like, oh, I just love you, come with me, and invite them and encourage them to join us in this space. And then the other thing that we're encouraging you to do, if you have the means and feel so moved, is that we also have a funded by the People's campaign for Project Peoples. So we are doing crowdfunding. We believe it's very important that Project Peoples is funded by the peoples and not just by foundations or grants, although we're searching for those too. And so if you feel so moved to donate and you have the means, you can donate to Project Peoples at this link that I just popped in the group chat. And if you feel so inclined to share that link with others and spread information about the project, we would really, really appreciate that. But I think that does bring us to the end of this wonderful time here today. I invite everyone to take just a deep breath in and let it out. Do that one more time, deep breath in. Let it out. And I hope that you go forward today taking a little bit more hope, a little more of that vision of the future that we're all striving to help create, and the knowledge that folks like David, like you all, are bringing it to life now. So I hope you go forward with some hope and excitement for whatever the rest of your day holds. And thank you all so much for joining us today in this space. Such joy.
Thanks so much.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Bye, everybody.
Thank
See you
y'all.
soon.
See you soon.
Bye-bye. Thanks, everybody.